What the heck is poopin', gamer girls? Welcome back to another regularly scheduled programming from your favorite professional YouTuber, Lambo Pokemon. I am back on the grind, as you can tell, consistently uploading every single day. That is a joke, but obviously, what we have going on here is a little lesson on Fairy Dragon Steel cores, and I prepared a little bit of something to kind of talk about it, but really I'd like to just make a series, not too planned, so I can just speak from my heart about the cores, but I want to go through and talk about some of the cores in drafting, especially for newer players or people who are not as familiar with draft formats in general, and talk about some of the misconceptions and misuses of cores. And I figured what better to start with than a Fairy Dragon Steel, because that's everybody's favorite, commonly known as the Dreamcore, as I like to call it. But yeah, farther ado, I've kind of already spoiled what it was. If you don't know what it is Fairy, Dragon, and Steel. Together, I believe the combination of the three resists every type except ground and ghost. So when you're building, make sure that one, you get a good, if you don't necessarily need a Fairy Dragon Steel core on every team. A lot of these are amazing types, so you'll probably want to get some of them anyway. But just keep in mind that you'll also want ground and ghost resistances on your squad as well, because if you get this, it can defend against a lot, but you'll still have issues with ground and ghost types. So if somebody has like a Zygarde and you don't draft any ground resistance, then he's just going to blow through your team. But you should know that already. So you don't want to be weak to ground and you don't want to be weak to ghost. Anyway, this is a defensive oriented core. So when you think about like the two main defensive oriented cores, the Dream Core and the Fire, Water, Grass core, you don't want to get these confused with offensive cores, because if you go through and you draft Fairy, Dragon, Steel types that have no defensive utility, think something like, well, I mean, they'll still have some defensive utility, I suppose, but think something like Rabombi or something is very, very frail, and you don't think of it as like a defensive centerpiece. Maybe in some matchups it is, but you really want to have these Fairy, Dragon, and Steel types that actually have some sort of defensive utility, and that's more of a problem with the Fire, Water, Grass core, and I will get to that when I get to the Fire, Water, Grass core video. But in Fairy, Dragon, and Steel, a lot of Fairy, Dragon, and Steel types have some pretty good defensive capabilities already, so it's a little bit less of an issue, but I will still show something going on there. But just an example of something that you can draft. This is just something that I threw together really, really quickly. I haven't really played with it or anything, but in theory it works. You know, I picked up two top tiers, Jirachi and Garchomp, both amazing Pokemon. Jirachi has incredible utility in so many different things. People run like Scarf Ironhead way too much, but it has incredible special sets, Calm Mind sets, a lot of really great lures, Wish Protect, and Stealth Rock. So something that's really great about this specific core is that Garchomp doesn't have a whole lot of recovery on its own, but you can run Wish Aromatisse, which you're probably going to be running every week anyway, but you also have the capability to run a Wish Jirachi as well. So Jirachi and Aromatisse give a lot of support to Garchomp, and likewise, Garchomp being a ground type and Jirachi being a steel type, they both really help with the poison type weakness of Aromatisse. Jirachi still has that steel resist for Aromatisse, and then Aromatisse kind of covers some of the weaknesses of the other things. So Jirachi, being a steel type, it has a lot of the resistances of the core because steel resists so much, but it also has the dual psychic typing, which complicates things a little bit more. But that's what really helps it fit in this core. The fairy type Aromates really resists that dark type for Jirachi as well. So it's kind of beyond just the fairy dragon steel typing because of the secondary types of Jirachi and Garchomp as well. You could also put something like Hydreigon on this core over top of Garchomp, because Hydreigon and like Steel Psychics have really good synergy. So Bronzong Hydreigon is solid. Metagross Hydreigon has really good defensive capabilities together. But notice like a couple things. So there are some steel types that don't resist ice necessarily, like Steelix. I love Steelix as a steel type. Ferrothorn. I love Ferrothorn as a steel type. Great, both great steel types, but they don't actually fit into a fairy dragon steel core exactly. Like obviously there are more things on your team, but one of the big things that your steel type is supposed to do for this core is be resistant against dragon and ice, because otherwise your dragon type can get overwhelmed. Obviously the fairy helps with the dragon resistance, but ice specifically, if you draft a steel type like Ferrothorn or Steelix, which are both incredible steel types in draft, don't get me wrong, but you're trying to slot them in this steel spot in the core and you don't have any backup resistances, like really good backup resistances to ice, then your core kind of falls apart, because remember, this is a defensive core. So you can still run a fairy dragon steel core with Ferrothorn in there, but you're just going to want to make sure that you have probably at least 2 good backup checks for that Ferrothorn's or for the core's ice weakness. So for instance, I don't know, I'm just making things up off the top of my head. So maybe a water type and a fire type, or maybe have some sort of ice type and fire type. You probably want a water type on your draft team anyway. But yeah, if you draft a Ferrothorn in the slot on this fairy dragon steel or Steelix or some other steel that doesn't actually resist ice type, then you really need to get something that will cover up that weakness that you've made based on the dual typing. So dual typings can complicate these cores a little bit, but you just have to like maybe even throw them into one of those type weakness checkers. That you can probably find those online if you can't do it in your head. But if you're thinking about making a fairy dragon steel core, take the 3 mons that you're thinking about building with, throw them in a type checker, and make sure that those secondary types aren't screwing up your core. So that's a really important thing to check as well. And remember, this is a defensive core, so you want the defensive utility to be there. They can still have plenty of offensive purpose. You don't want it to be a super passive core, because a lot of dragon and fairy and steel types have good offensive stats as well, but you want them to cover each other's weaknesses defensively. That's the whole point of the core. So this is just an example of something that would work as a solid dream core, and I chose Aromates as like a low tier fairy type because just because points, you know, like I didn't think about points too much, but I was like, if you're getting Garchomp and Jirachi, you probably need to save on points somewhere else. So Aromates, maybe Comfy. Yeah, honestly, let's go through some of the fairy types that you can choose in this slot here. So if we take a look down the list, you're probably not going to be able to, if you get like Jirachi and Garchomp, you're probably going to have to go for a cheaper fairy. A lot of times Klefki might still be up there. I don't like Mimikyu on fairy dragon steel cores personally. One, I just hate Mimikyu as a Pokemon. I think it sucks. I mean, it's got utility on like hyper offense, but it's just so underwhelming all the time. I really can't get behind Mimikyu. But some low tier fairies that might work, like Sylveon's usually super expensive though, so Aromates works well. If you have a Sylvali fairy can work. Whimsicott can work, but sometimes struggles defensively, because if you look at its stats, it's like 60, 85, 75. And it's supposed to have this defensive utility, but if you're just playing a a dragon type that can tech on one poison move, then your fairy type completely crumbles, and then you better make sure that you have a really good steel type in your core if you want to have Whimsicott. So that's my advice. It also stacks another ice weakness. So if you're going to have a Whimsicott on a fairy dragon steel core, you better really get a good steel type that resists ice, like super resists ice, and can really be a really solid backup check for opposing dragons, because that can be a real issue. Alcremie can work. I often find it underwhelming, but Mawile, here's one of the things. Like, Mawile is a fairy and a steel. If you're getting Mega Mawile, that's different because he has a lot more bulk, but like regular Mawile is often so underwhelming with like 50, 55 special bulk, and it's a little more physically bulky, especially with Intimidate. But you're probably going to want to have like backup steals, because a lot of times what your steel type is going to do is be switching into ice beams for your dragon, and like a lot of ice types are just are honestly gonna like 2-hit KO Mawile, especially with rocks up or something. So that you want to think about probably a better fairy type than Mawile in this core. That's the thing. Like, if you want it to be a defensive core. So if you have these steel types that can't fit, steel or fairy types that can't fit the role defensively, then you really want to rethink your core probably. Shiinotic again introduces another ice weakness and is very passive. Can probably work on some team, but Wigglytuff, I'm a bigger fan of Wigglytuff. I think Wigglytuff has definitely some utility, but the biggest issue about Wigglytuff for a Fairy Dragon Steel core is that it kind of takes away your fighting resistance for the squad. So if you have Wigglytuff, maybe Jirachi is a good steel type. You probably want to have backup fighting resists on your team. It also depends how many mons you're allowed to draft. If you're playing in one of these leagues that you draft like 11 mons, some of these things don't matter as much because you can back it up a little bit better with your 8 other mons. But if you're playing in an 8 mon draft, then you really want to think about the synergies of your Fairy Dragon Steel or the synergies of your other things, because every mon counts for more. Other things that work in this slot, let's pull up some steel types. Ooh, steel. Steel types, Corviknight is incredible, but again, it doesn't provide that ice resistance, so you probably want to have your ice resistance elsewhere. Then again, Corviknight is just so freaking bulky that it might cover that up enough. That's going to be a team-by-team thing that you're going to want to think about. Excadrill. Excadrill does have good defensive utilities, especially in some matchups, but a lot of times you don't think of Excadrill as a steel type. Like, offensively, it's a steel type, but it's more of a like offensive mon. You think of it more of like a ground type. And some of these other things like Kartana, you don't really want Kartana. So you definitely don't want Kartana as your steel type in the Fairy Dragon Steel. So you probably want a secondary steel type if you're going to get that. Melmetal, incredible. Some lower tier ones that I really love. I think Bronzong is incredible. Bronzong is so good. Magnezone, Magneton, not very good, not great defensive utility, but can suffice. Cobalion, another one that is not good for the core because of the lack of fairy resistance. So Cobalion can work on teams and is a good draft mon, but I would say if you're going to get a Cobalion, you probably want another steel type and just good fairy resistances in general. Metagross is incredible. Love Metagross, great draft mon. Registeel. Steelix, again, this is one that you'd probably want good ice resistances or just a backup steel type in general. Bronzong's great. Lucario, not good. Lucario does not, if you have, this is the kind of thing that I see. I like talk to these newer players. They're like, I have my Fairy Dragon Steel core, man. I got like, look at I got Lucario. It's my steel type. It's like, okay, no, this is a defensive core. It's not an offensive core. We'll talk about some offensive cores later as well. Like, I believe Fighting Psychic, and I'll have to think about them more when it's not off the top of my head, but like Lucario is not a defensive mon, okay? Like he's going to die to just about everything. 70, 70, 70. No, he might have like a little slack off or something, but you're not running defensive Lucario. Don't do that. A couple other things. Aggron, like once you get down to some of these lower tiers, it's like these mons are so niche. Like a lot of matchups, they're just not going to fare well in that. It's like, are you really going to be able to bring this to a game consistently? And if you can't bring it to a game consistently, what's the point in having this core? So I would say definitely look for mons that you can actually consistently bring to games, and that would fit in this steel slot. So I love Bronzong, I love Metagross, I love Jirachi. I think the steel psychics are really fun to use. Yeah, again, Doublade can work. Klefki, I love Klefki. Klefki is a great mon. Scizor is a great mon in this core, especially when you play with like Megas and stuff. Mega Scizor, Mega Aggron, those are fantastic slots for the steel type. And finally, let's look at the dragon type. And then after this, I also do have an example of a bad core, and I'm gonna kind of talk you through why it's a bad core. But let's look at these dragons first. Lots of Ubers. Basically, all of these dragons can. Oh, sorry, not Dracozolt. I just looked at Dracozolt. I would not say Dracozolt is good in a Fairy Dragon Steel core. If you got Lucario, Rabombi, Dracozolt, you do not have your Dream Core. That doesn't count. Those are not going to be like switch. Maybe they can switch into one resisted hit, but like honestly, you're not going to be switching into 2 resisted hits. Something like Garchomp or Latios or Hydreigon have tons of resistances, can switch into multiple hits. A lot of these dragons have some sort of recovery. But something like Dracozolt, decent, but you really don't want to be switching it in like that. It can function, but I would steer you away from that. And that's the thing, like a lot of these dragons are so expensive, like Salamence, Kyurem, Komodo. These are all other things that are decent in these cores, but one of the big problems about Kyurem is that it doesn't resist fire for your steel type. So you're going to want to have decent fire backups if you have Kyurem. But a lot of these dragons, Noivern, like these all work, but you just want to be conscious of your points. A lot of these things are more expensive. Noivern and down is kind of where it gets a little cheaper. Zygarde 10%, it can, like you're probably going to want to switch it into some attacks sometime throughout the season, but that's not going to be a consistent piece of your defensive core. Zygarde 10% is never going to be a consistent piece of your defensive core. So when you're building this Dream Core, it's not going to be part of it. Flygon, on the other hand, Flygon has the same typing, and it has Roost, and it has Levitate, and it has more defensive utility. So Flygon can function in here, you know. Duraludon, it's another one of the things like Mawile that has 2 types in the core, and it can, but it can be your Dragon type maybe, but it wouldn't be as good as your Steel type in the core. Like you'd probably want a secondary Steel because you need an Ice resist and whatnot. A lot of these lower tier dragons probably aren't too worth getting. Drampa, I would say that is probably one of the lower tier dragons that can still fulfill this core. If you're rocking like a low tier fairy dragon steel core with like Appleton and stuff, it's like, okay, well, you might want to you might want to rethink it. Like you might want to rethink the structure of the team as a whole. Like that's something that people really want to do. They want to say every team has to have this core, and a lot of times you're going to want a dragon type because it resists a lot of common attacking types. A lot of times you'll want a steel and a fairy. But if you have to compromise to the point where you're rocking like Appleton on your team, it's like, okay, well, I mean, no hate to like the big Appleton fans, but like you might want to rethink whether this is the centerpiece of your team and the centerpiece of your building if you're trying to build around Appleton Dreamcore. So that being said, I'm going to pull up an example of a bad team here, just so that we can kind of talk through some of the issues around here. So first things first, Fairy Dragon Steel Core does not resist ghost or ground. And as you can see here, ground just bops this entire core. This is going to be more of an issue in formats that have hidden power, because you can just tech like hidden power ground on this. Like a lot of these things are still, a lot of these things like look at this. A lot of these have good defensive utility, but hidden power ground can be an issue, but a lot of these have decent SPDF. But Earthquake just has such high distribution that you can Earthquake this whole squad, and there goes your whole Fairy Dragon Steel. Then you're gonna have to get multiple things to try to cover that with the rest of the team, and it's probably not worth it. Another thing, this has no recovery. So if you're building a faster paced BO team that isn't relying as much on recovery, maybe that could work, but this isn't really a very offensive 3. So I feel like if you're drafting these 3, since these are a more defensive 3, you're gonna want a like some sort of wish passer or something, which would really more commonly be fulfilled by your fairy type, but Diancie can't really pass any wishes because it can't even heal itself. So that's another issue here. Your steel type doesn't resist ice. Your dragon type is weak to it. Your fairy type doesn't resist it. So something like ice ground coverage could potentially just bop your entire team. There are going to be matchups where this will work, but when you're drafting, you want to think of not how can I really win in specific matchups. It's got to be, I want my team to be able to beat all the other teams in this league, which means it has to have some sort of more general utility that you can shape to all the different teams you're going to play. And in some of those bigger tournaments like Trick House or Cash Gang or whatnot, you don't know who you're going to be playing. Your draft pool is different than the pools that you're going to be playing against, and likewise, when you get into playoffs, you have no idea who you could be up against. So if you're not drafting a defensive core that can really mold itself to a lot of different matchups, then you're going to have issues. So I think I'll cut it there. 23 minutes looks about good. Hopefully this was a little... hopefully it was very informative, but hopefully it was intelligible, because I didn't write down too many thoughts or prepare too many things. I was just kind of speaking from my heart and telling you how I really feel. But I think next time I really want to cover fire, water, grass cores, because I think that's where a lot of the issues around lack of defensive utility comes in. But anyway, call it there. Hope you guys all have a freaking wonderful day. I will catch you on the flip side.